We'll wait for about 30 seconds before, just to make sure that everybody can join in, and then we'll start. Right, this gives me great pleasure to welcome John Burge, our webinar speaker for this Health Applications Society webinar series that we started last year. I think John needs no introduction, but I'll just say a few words. Kind of a rare speaker to have volunteered for our seminar series. John is a member of NAE. John was the editor-in-chief of Math Programming. And John, I believe, is the editor-in-chief of Operations Research. John was my dean many years ago before he switched institutions. And now he is a distinguished professor, chaired professor at Chicago's Booth School of Business. I think that's enough for John's introduction. I don't need to say anything more. John, really great seeing you again.
Yeah, thanks.
The floor is
thanks,
yours.
Sanjay. Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Sanjay and I are in the middle of a snowstorm here in Chicago, so it's warming to be talking to friends in this audience. This is some thoughts that I've had kind of going through the pandemic and doing work on different aspects of the pandemic, and then reflecting on what's our impact on the world in terms of operations research. For those of you who might have been up late in the evening US time, a few weeks ago when I spoke at the Hong Kong meeting, I was a little bit more optimistic then. So this talk is similar to what I gave there, but it reflects maybe my thinking that maybe things weren't quite as rosy as I was seeing them, but I still have some optimism. So hopefully there's opportunities for us to do more. And so we can always look at every challenge and think, oh, but that's just creating more opportunities. And so I think maybe there are many new opportunities for OR in healthcare, and particularly in dealing with pandemics. So what I'm going to do is I'll mention some things that we all are quite familiar with. And I just saw there was a question, but I'm not sure if there is a question. But
no, I think this is raised hand, John.
Okay.
We're just checking whether there's a question. I think no, there's a good. So maybe we'll let you finish your presentation just to keep things orderly, and then entertain all the questions at the end.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so obviously COVID-19 has impacted the world, and it has impacted operations research in particular. And many of us have done work on COVID-19 in different aspects. In particular, I think we've looked at issues like forecasting, like modeling, like actually doing the epidemiological models, or trying to improve on epidemiological models. We've also looked at issues that I'm sort of broadly categorizing as logistics, things like getting supplies to places, or allocating scarce resources, or getting vaccines to people. We've looked at many of those kinds of issues as well. And many of us have also done work in terms of mitigation strategies, whether it's in terms of the vaccines or also in terms of non-pharmaceutical interventions. So many of us have done this kind of work. And if we are sort of honest with ourselves, we would like to see some impact in the world from this, or we would think that we would have some impact in the world. And I think it's very hard to find that. Where is the overall impact? And if it isn't really clear, why is that? And I'll try to give some proposals for what might be reasons that involve things like lack of clarity, that we're not providing enough information, or not enough information is being provided to people in terms of making decisions. And in particular, then I think there's been a really poor use of quantifying uncertainty. And what we've seen is things that were very, very uncertain, but people who are incredibly confident and then incredibly wrong. And so we have to have, I think, more humility, but not just humility, but to use our tools to be able to describe uncertainty in different ways. And I think that's one of the things that has led to our not having the impact that I believe we could have had in terms of this overall pandemic. So what I'm going to do is I'll go through and give a little bit of a view of what people have done, and then the impact. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I've worked on that I think should have provided at least some insights into some kinds of aspects of dealing with the pandemic, and then talk about the impact of that. So I'll talk about it in terms of forecasting or modeling, like epidemiological modeling, and then in terms of logistics or supply chains, and then in terms of mitigation strategies. And then I'll describe possible explanations. In particular, I think we somehow miss, and often do this in our work, that the role that ambiguity may play in how people make decisions, whether it's policymakers or whether it's individuals. But ambiguity can play a large role in making those decisions. And that means that our models actually have to adjust for that. So in looking at, in particular, at making policy recommendations or having some implication for policy, we have to think about the role of ambiguity. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then present some conclusions. And as I say, in the end, I think it just says that we have more work to do. And so you can see, even though I'll sort of say things that are negative about what's happened from the world's perspective in terms of operations research. But in the end, I think it again provides us more opportunities for research going forward. So I see that as a positive, and I'll try to conclude that way. All right, so let's start with forecasting. I will introduce these topics with Google Trends. I like to look at Google Trends to get an idea of what's going on in the world. What are people looking at? This is essentially calibrating the relative search intensity over time for different keywords. And what I'm showing on this slide is searches for statistics. And as you can see, in the early stage of the pandemic, people were searching for statistics a lot. The people, I think, were really interested in these mathematical models because I think they thought, oh, that will give us some clarity about when the disease might finally be under control. And that they thought, oh, these mathematical models are going to give us some certainty about that. They're going to inform us, and we should take comfort in those predictions. And people were looking to gather information about statistics. But as you can see, after the beginning of the pandemic, it looks like the interest has sort of just dwindled. So we're seeing fewer and fewer people looking for statistics. And I think that's an indication that, well, maybe maybe people don't think what's being done with statistics or what's being done in terms of forecasting and modeling has been all that effective. I'm going to talk about a paper that's from Ioannidis, Cripps, and Martin Tanner, one of Sanjay's colleagues, one of my former colleagues at Northwestern. And they looked at the overall effectiveness of different forecasts. So looking at a wide range of different kind of models and how they were predicting different aspects of the disease. What you see here on this chart is a chart for ICU intensity in 3 different states: in California, this is California, New Jersey, and New York. And they start from a current point here. And then you can see these are 95% confidence intervals for their prediction of ICU beds for the disease over the next several weeks. And so what you can see is that, and the red line is the actual number of ICU beds. So what you can see is that often that the models are relatively accurate, like here in California, they were relatively accurate in the beginning. However, notice how most of, in fact, all of these 3 models, or all these 3 predictions, the confidence intervals are getting very close to a single point as we go forward in time, essentially predicting that the disease is going away. As you go forward in time, whereas in reality, for example, here in California, the number of ICU cases was actually relatively constant over this period, and it eventually escapes this 95% confidence band sometime in the future. Then you have other examples where the confidence bands are not accurate for very long, here in New Jersey, and where then the actual cases are far above what were predicted by the models. But just to show that they're not consistently incorrect, that they're not always undershooting. Here's an example for New York, where the actual cases were much less. So they were under forecasting at the beginning of this period, and then dramatically over forecasting at the beginning of the period, and then under forecasting, in other words, predicting less than the actual number that were observed in the later period. And that the confidence intervals are, I mean, these are 95% confidence bounds, and none of them is capturing what's happening more than 2 or 3 weeks into the future. In fact, even if you go just, let's say, 1 week into the future, these models were not very accurate. This is showing these are 4 models, and this is the colors correspond to the fraction of time that the actual number of cases or your ICU beds were within the 95% prediction interval. And so what you, and the colors then would correspond to the redder colors are closer to 100%, and the more blue colors are closer to 0%. So what you would expect is that most of these should be red, in that they're 95% confidence intervals, and you would expect, well, about 95% of the time that the prediction, and this is just a 1-step prediction, just the prediction 1 step ahead should be within that 95% prediction interval, 95% of the time. But the only model that this was true for was this model down here. And even that model is sometimes not very accurate. That is, only 50% of the time in some of these places. But most of them are actually wildly inaccurate in terms of these, even in terms of 95% prediction intervals. So the models were not just bad in making point forecasts. They have been very bad in terms of any kind of confidence bounds. They have not been able to capture what has actually happened. And as we've gone through with new variants, this trend has just continued, that we're just seeing predictions that really are meaningless, that they're not, even on very short time horizons, have not been very accurate. Oops. This chart is also to show not only have the models not been very accurate, but they also disagree with one another by a wide margin. Okay, so these are predictions for deaths by different models from a period starting, this was late June of 2021, and then going out 4 weeks. And what you'll see is this would be the 4-week predictions, and then you see these prediction intervals colored around them. If you go from the bottom of one of the prediction intervals to sort of the top of one of the topmost prediction interval, you'll see a difference of 200 to 1. That is, this model is predicting that there's a potential for 200 times as many cases as there would be from down here. And even the mean forecasts have a difference that's on the order of 20. So models, each of which is supposedly based on firm scientific basis, they're coming up with very different answers, and coming up with different answers also doesn't give people a lot of confidence. So I think in general, the net effect of this has been that people have lost confidence in modeling, that people are not believing statistics that might have been reported, and have somewhat lost faith in those who are providing these kinds of forecasts. So there seem to be more. It's sort of paradoxical that we have people that are more interested, but now becoming more interested, but also distrusting of these modeling efforts as we've gone through the pandemic. And I would say there's certainly a great deal of skepticism, probably an increasing level of skepticism about mathematical modeling in general. And about not just that people like us are not very good at making predictions, but that we're overly confident about making those predictions as well. So we suffer both from ignorance and hubris, and that's I think that's not so great for our profession, but I think it's something that we just can observe, that people are very reluctant now to believe any of the things that we might be predicting. Okay, so from a modeling forecasting, well, maybe we should just, maybe we should sort of stay out of that. That's kind of an area that's not necessarily one where we have expertise. That is, epidemiology might not be an area where we have particular expertise, and maybe we should leave that up to the epidemiologists to be inaccurate about, or to be wrong about, so that maybe we should stay away from that. But closer to us is things like logistics and supply chains that we feel that we have a lot of knowledge about, and that we can offer lots of advice about, and that we can discover things about through the pandemic. And as you see here, I have the Google Trends, both for supply chain and for logistics. You see there's not much in terms of logistics. It maybe has a slight upward trend, but certainly not too much. Supply chain had a big spike in the end of 2021, when we saw all these supply chain issues and people were interested. No, let me learn about supply chains. So we probably have seen some growing interest, but not a great deal. But maybe that's okay. That the public not so much interested in logistics and supply chain, but maybe had some spike in interest over these supply chain disruptions and inflation. But maybe we're still having some effect in terms of how supply chains are actually operating. But if we look at that kind of data, think about what's happening with the global supply chain. This is an area that I've worked on. I had this paper with Shnayatja, Xiang Wang, and Jing Wu. And we looked at the impact of COVID-19 in terms of, well, whether you had supply chain partners who were in parts of the world that were affected by the pandemic. And how did your supply chain partners who were in those parts of the world, when they were most affected by the pandemic, how did that affect your position in terms of your business? And in particular, how did it affect your credit risk? So we looked at the effect of supply chain partners on credit default swap prices, which you can think of as essentially insurance against a firm's defaulting on its credit, on its loans. So if I'm a lender and I would like to have some insurance, I can purchase one of these credit default swap contracts, which will pay me in the event of a default of the lender, and reimburse whatever the amount that is lost after that default might be. So it's insurance on the losses in the event that the borrower defaults. And what we did was to look at, in particular, firms in the United States that had partners in China, and firms in the United States that did not have supply chain partners in China. And the reason for doing that was that in the first phase of the pandemic, we noticed that a lot of businesses in China were shut down. So as China was trying to control the virus at the very first stage of the pandemic, those businesses were shut down, but businesses within the US remained open. But then we noticed that there was a second phase where businesses were reopening in China, but in the US and much of the rest of the world, those businesses were now shutting down. So we had two different parts of two different phases of initial reactions. And we looked at the differences between firms that had partners in China. This is American firms that had partners in China, and those that did not. And what we saw was the following, we looked at the abnormal. So we look at the credit default swap difference in price for firms that had Chinese partners and for firms that did not have Chinese partners. And we did it for both firms that have suppliers, so the ones with the boxes correspond to suppliers, and for the ones that are dark correspond to suppliers, and the ones that are light correspond to customers. And then the ones who have Chinese partners are the boxes, and the ones that have no Chinese partners are the X's here. So what we see is in the first phase of the pandemic, these spikes here correspond to increases in the credit default swap, which then means these firms are perceived as being riskier. So firms that had exposure to partners, both suppliers and customers, in this first phase of the pandemic had higher credit default swap spreads or prices than those firms that did not have Chinese suppliers. However, after the period where the US starts to close and China is starting to open, here's China starting to open, now the US closing, then we see things reverse. So firms now that have no Chinese suppliers, they're getting riskier, and firms that do have Chinese suppliers, they're not perceived as risky. And in fact, the difference is even greater for how much these firms have recovered as to how much these firms have been hurt. So the lesson was that having supply chain partners in different parts of the world, particularly here, having partners in China when either China was affected mostly by the pandemic, and then when it was not as affected as others by the pandemic, that had implications for the risk of the firms with partners in those locations. On balance, it appeared that having more of these connections, because we saw that on balance, the firms that had the Chinese partners ended up better off after the end of this period. So it appears that those risk mitigation effects of global supply chains, those might dominate, and that introduces that there may be many interesting topics to consider in terms of supply chain disruptions, partner effects, and supply chain network design. So it tells us something about supply chains. We should learn something more about supply chains, something more about the pandemic. But has that had an effect in terms of how supply chains are organized? And this is just one lesson, and there are many other people who are looking at different lessons like this about logistics and supply chains. Has that had an effect on supply chains? Well, it does not appear that it's had too much of a positive effect in any way. If you look here, these are container freight prices, global container freight prices from the period before the pandemic, July of 19, up until the current period. And just to give a possible explanation, I put crude oil down here as well. You can remember that in the end of 2019, there was that time when, or the latter half of 2019, there was that time when crude oil prices actually became negative, which was kind of strange. But for the most part, crude oil prices have remained, somewhere north of $50 a barrel. But container prices have gone all the way from about $1,200 here up to $10,000. So there's been an increase of about 800% in container freight. whereas the increase in crude oil prices is about 50%. So if you look at it here, the overall increases, crude oil has only gone up by 50%, but freight prices have gone up by 800%. So they've gone up 16 times as much as the fuel costs. So the container price is not just reflecting the cost of energy. The container price is reflecting something about the cost of logistics. It looks like globally, we've somehow gotten worse at logistics since the beginning of the pandemic. And in fact, it's much, much worse. So these global freight prices, outstripping almost any other kind of inflation you can think of. And they are the most directly related to logistics. And that's not a very encouraging sign at all. So we see something else there that looks to be not indicating a great deal of effect from our field, or at least not positive effects. And finally, the last one I'll talk about is mitigation efforts. And I think many of us have thought, oh, yes, we should be using our skills in operations research and analytics, which we like to brand ourselves with. We should be using those skills to help control this pandemic and to do whatever we can to aid in terms of policymaking with respect to the pandemic. Here's just a view of if you think that analytics is kind of the new big trend, or was the new big trend, it is trending, but it's all trending down. So you can see here, analytics over the period of the pandemic has been on a pretty steady decline, and it's down. It's about a third now in terms of search relative to what it was before the pandemic began. Maybe people just aren't interested in analytics. Yes, I think that's probably true. Again, I think this has something to do with the skepticism. Now, I'll just mention about some of the work that I've done here with Ozan Candu and Yiding Feng. This paper on controlling epidemic spread. And that's all about using targeted closures as opposed to sort of broad lockdowns. Broad lockdowns are a very blunt instrument at trying to control disease in a large region. And we know that the disease spreads through local contacts. I mean, it is a spread primarily indoors, obviously, and involves people having to be within proximity of one another. So that does happen on a local basis. And so thinking about it in terms of these local regions is a way in which we might be able to get broader control. And so we looked at, well, what would happen if we had targeted business closures at the level of something like zip codes. So at the zip code level, or even somewhat wider level, we use New York City as our test case, and consider the interactions, consider how people move about, where they work, and how many of them from each neighborhood go to every other neighborhood, and even how many of them are able to work from home, and how many have to, if they are working, they have to go and work on site. And looked at what would be the difference if we had these targeted kind of lockdowns that would occur, in other words, would be determined for each of the different subregions within an overall broad region like New York City. And what would be the difference in terms of targeting relative to just doing it uniformly across the region? And what we found was something like this using this New York data. So these solid lines, this is how much of employment would be able to be retained. We used employment as our overall measure. And this is how much employment would be able to be retained for a goal of not increasing the number of cases from whatever a baseline was. So this is allowing, that this green line says, we would be allowing anywhere from 40%. These are for different parameters down here, 40% up to 70% of the work to proceed, whereas the dotted lines down here correspond to the same values for having just a single policy, single uniform policy throughout the city. The different lines correspond to what happens outside the city. So this would be if outside the city is totally locked down, that's the green. If outside the city is just 50% locked down, that's the red. And if outside the city is completely open, that would be the blue. And what you can see is that by targeting, we would be able to achieve the same goal and allow for, say, 4 or 6 times the overall level of employment. So that seems to be something that would be quite encouraging and something that policymakers could take advantage of. And we've been talking about this for quite a while, so it has been, people have been aware of it. And even in New York City, they did try something that was actually similar to this, but they didn't use the network effects. They just looked locally, which was as if everybody just stayed within their local region without interacting with others, and sort of came up with a policy that was based on that. So some people have been aware of it, and maybe they've been able to learn from having this kind of targeting. But has that had an effect? So here's just a look at different countries. I just sort of took some out randomly just because they had different values. But these are COVID cases in Denmark, Sweden, Italy, the US, India, and Malawi. And you can say, oh, the US is doing better in terms of cases relative to Denmark, at least in this most recent period. So maybe that's the effect of, maybe there are more OR people in the US. Maybe that's the effect relative to Denmark. Although certainly there are many more OR people in the US than there are in Malawi. I chose Malawi just because it is one of the poorest countries in the world, and does not have too many OR people. But they certainly do not have the number of cases per million that the US has, and nowhere near what's happening in Denmark. And actually, Denmark does have a lot of OR people. So that doesn't seem to be all that encouraging, but at least the US was doing better, or looks better on this chart relative to Denmark. However, if I do it in terms of deaths, doesn't look as good. So in this case, US is now, it's kind of taken over the lead here. It's been in the lead for the last several months, relative to at least this group of other countries. Yeah, so certainly if I was looking at sort of intensity of OR work, that doesn't seem to have had a great mitigating effect on COVID-19. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other population considerations to think about, but it doesn't seem like we've had a great deal of effect. Okay, so why might that be? Why given, we've seen all these things that we can talk about the successes of OR, that, all these lessons like from the Battle of Britain, when the dealing with the energy crisis, we think we had some effect there. We think we've been able to increase food supplies around the world. We think we've made transportation in general cheaper. We think we've made communications cheaper overall. We think we've made healthcare things like imaging and radiation therapy improved. We've created all kinds of productivity tools, even done things for sports, analytics in terms of things like Moneyball. So why is it that people, after all these successes and everything, why is it that we still see that we don't appear to have had much of an impact in this pandemic, and people aren't even interested in analytics anymore? It seems that it's not a very popular term for people. Yeah, so why might that be? So let me think a little bit about why that might be. So what we know about how people make decisions. Well, we think people are mostly rational, but there are certain things that they're averse to. And I think one of the things they're averse to is ambiguity. And I don't think ambiguity is helped by predictions that end up being inaccurate. And particularly when you have confidence in those predictions and they end up being inaccurate, I think that probably leads people to distrust whatever is being presented to them. And that creates even more ambiguity. And we know that people avoid choices when they have ambiguous outcomes. They prefer outcomes that are where they have more evidence, where they know more about, that they have some tangible evidence, that they know more about what might occur. And people are less hesitant to avoid those kinds of decisions when they have more of that evidence. But I think what's happened is many of the policy responses that we've seen, and a lot of these predictions and a lot of these inaccurate stories have actually led to sort of a pervasiveness of ambiguity. I'll use a little example for those of you who've gone through this, where you're given a decision about having an angiogram, having basically a probe go through your arteries up to check them out, and it's a procedure that's often useful, particularly if you have a potential cardiac issue, and you think about that. You may wonder, okay, so what's the risk of it? Well, yeah, there's a risk, there's a complication. Often they'll tell you that, well, the complication is that one of the side effects is that you might die. If you read all the material that they give you, yeah, you'll sort of discover, oh, well, the probability that you might not survive this procedure is about 1 in 10,000. Well, yeah, 1 in 10,000, that's pretty rare. But if you took that risk every day, well, you kind of expect to live about 27 years. Well, if you're young, that wouldn't be very good. Maybe if you're older, that wouldn't matter too much. But that's it could be a significant risk. However, it could be that it prolongs your life. So there's that, it could discover something that you would need a stent for, or perhaps bypass surgery. So it could prolong your life, but you have to make this decision. And the way we would think about it is we'd say, oh, well, I'd have this decision tree and have either I can choose the angiography and there's a possibility that I don't survive, or maybe they discover something and I get treated and I get the value of treatment. So you probably have some aversion to risk. So probably depending on your risk aversion, this is like the value if you end up healthy. This value if you're totally healthy from the beginning. This is if you get treatment, and this is if you don't get treatment. From a sort of rational operations research decision analysis kind of view, you would go ahead and say, well, suppose I end up deciding not to have an angiography. What does that mean? Well, let's see. It means maybe your expected utility is positive. This would be the equation for that. Expected utility to be positive. And that might be true for one of two reasons. Either that you think the risk of the value of of even being sick and not getting the procedure is not too bad. In other words, that you of not having the procedure is sufficiently large, or it could be that you think that the chance that you have that any disease is actually pretty small. That Q is pretty small, but you can't really tell which. You might either it might be your choice in terms of utility or your kind of aversion to risk, or it could be your perception about what the chance is of your having a disease. So the overall implication here is it could be one of those two things, but there's also this fact that maybe it has to do with how much you trust whatever that prediction is about the probability that you have this disease. So the physician might tell you, well, this is what I think that chance might be. But how well do you trust that? That's the role of ambiguity. That's the fact that when a physician says this is safe, and that might be also about what they say about the procedure. They might say, well, procedure is safe, but maybe they mean, oh, the procedure is safe if it has less than a 1% chance of killing you. Or maybe they mean they would only say that it's safe if it's like 1 in 100,000 chance of killing you. So it could be very, very different depending on how you might perceive what safe means, and depending on how well you trust what those numbers are. So ambiguity could play a big role. We know that it plays a big role since Ellsberg's discovery that people actually, people make different choices if they are uncertain about what the information might be, or in this case, like the number of balls in an urn, or number of different colored balls in an urn. So that people tend not to want to make choices where there is this kind of ambiguous outcome. And so that ambiguous outcome about, well, I'm not really sure about what's the chance that that this procedure might be dangerous, this little p here. What that means is anything that I choose with taking that action is going to be worth less than if I didn't make that choice. So making this ambiguous choice means it's worth less to me. And now the choice about choosing the angiography is also affected by this ambiguity in those choices, which is effectively like making the utility less if I make that choice to go ahead with the procedure. That's kind of what I'm illustrating here in this diagram. that effectively I've made all of the things that might occur if I make that choice to go ahead with the procedure. I've made all of those values somewhat less. So what role does this play with COVID-19? Well, I think what it means is that, well, people, in order to have people make willing choices, then you should give them more data, as much data as possible. But you also have to be very clear about it. Instead, I think we've seen somewhat selective disclosures of data, and again, inaccurate kinds of predictions. And sometimes things that might even be contrary to just standard individual rational decision making. And this effect of not admitting to realistic uncertainty bounds, not using realistic quantification of uncertainty, I think that has led people not to view things as much more ambiguous than they might. That is, that when they hear things, they no longer hear a single number, or even a single number plus or minus 50%, more like plus or minus 500%. So they're very skeptical about that, and therefore they perceive anything that's being portrayed to them as quite ambiguous. You could see this. I'll go through this relatively quickly in terms of people's willingness to have vaccine, or people's hesitancy to have vaccine. That, if we think about it from just expected value point of view, the treatment, let's say there's a complication probability of P again, and the contracting the disease, let's say maybe and succumbing to disease is Q. We can do the same sort of decision tree, but if the patient refuses to have the vaccine, it could be that it could be that they have different perceptions about the P and the Q. In general, that, like, if you look at the CDC website, you would think, oh, the chance of severe, like death from the vaccine is very small, maybe only 2 in 100,000. Whereas the chance, if you get COVID a priori, when you're one of the in terms of the case fatality rate, would be about 0.5%. So it seems like it's pretty clear that on that basis, if your average person, the average person presumably would only rationally choose to have a vaccine. However, individuals might be different. For example, young people, particularly young males, though may also be young females. That those two values might actually be somewhat closer to one another. But even more so than the fact that for some groups there may be not too large a difference, particularly if we use realistic confidence bounds, not too much of a difference between the effect of the vaccine and the potential loss from the disease. The fact that we're not very explicit, and again, not very explicit about the uncertainty, creates a great deal of ambiguity. And creating a great deal of ambiguity is going to lead to hesitancy. Okay, so our models would predict that many more people, that if people are given more data, then people should refuse vaccines more than if they were given more data. And in other words, giving people more information would mean that more people would take the vaccine. So being more forthcoming about what the potential dangers of the vaccine are would probably lead, or should lead, to more people actually accepting the vaccine. That obfuscating those kinds of results might be detrimental to having people actually accept having a vaccine. So that's kind of a contrary indication that it's the opposite of what is intended, that the intention is to, I believe that the intention is to hide side effects to some extent, or at least not to make side effects very visible, in an effort to have people be willing to take the vaccine, whereas I think perhaps the opposite effect might actually be true. But that just means that there's many more things that we need to look at, and many more things that we can research. So to conclude and give hopefully some time for questions, I think a lot of effort has been made in making better forecasting models. So we've done a lot in terms of logistics and increasing the efficiency of supply chains and trying to improve mitigation efforts. But it is very difficult, I think, to identify overall, just globally overall positive impacts in terms of either more accurate forecasts, decreases in terms of logistics costs, that's very hard to see, or reductions in terms of the impact of the disease. So some of the reasons I think are the lack of clarity and overconfidence, as I've tried to emphasize here. I also think, and I didn't talk about it as much, I also think there may be some conflicting goals with policymakers. That's another area in which I think our models can contribute. So thinking about policymakers' goals as well in terms of how you phrase things, I think that's an important consideration. And as I said, I think the bottom line, even though I don't think we can say that we've had, at least not a demonstrable positive impact on the course of the disease, I think it opens up many areas for us to engage in going forward. And I think it will keep us busy for a long time. So thank you, and maybe I'll have a question or two.
John, really appreciate this. Is wonderful talk, encompassing a lot of different domains. Economics, finance, operations, if you like, ethics, policy. Truly reflective of you,
Thank you.
how work, how much work you've done over the years. We have a few questions. Let me open the floor for that. So we have Ross Schechter, and his question is, what role has disinformation played in amplifying many of the issues that you mentioned, particularly about ambiguity?
Yeah, I think, yeah, disinformation, conflicting information, I think, is going to lead people to disbelieve things. So anything that's conflicting, I think that makes people not trust what they're hearing. So yeah, so I think conflicting information is always going to have an amplifying role. So I think that does amplify people's perceptions of ambiguity.
Steve Vijan, what can we do to either create or develop more accurate models?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think, so one thing is that we tend to make assumptions about environments that fit the tools that we have. And so I think we have to open ourselves to being able to look at models in sort of a meta model kind of framework. Yeah, we may not just have an SEIR model, but there may be some other way in which the disease is actually going to progress. And so maybe having multiple models, one of which might be SEIR, and maybe we have other kinds of models. That's one way I think we could look at having, well, at least having better information about quantifying uncertainty. Because I think that's as I said, I think that's one of the biggest problems we have is we're not even able to quantify how bad we are at predicting things. And so, or how bad our models are.
I mean, building on that, let me ask you a question. So we know that sometimes it's very hard to predict, particularly when it was very early in the stage of pandemic. And I think you touched on this issue. Should we have been just a lot more modest about projecting into the future, given the amount of uncertainty and ambiguity that was present back in, say, mid-March of the pandemic, the year when pandemic hit?
Yeah, I think, yeah, we should have had a lot more humility, I think. Yeah, I think that we should have been much more modest in terms of any kind of predictions, because it's clear.
I mean, many of the parameters were just simply not known. Even if you're thinking SEIR, I mean, R naughts were just not available, and you only had like few hundred cases popping up, and people were already projecting months out.
Right, and one thing that I know is when we started to do simulations, we would get wildly different results, just with minor changes in the initial conditions, right? And
absolutely.
And so not knowing the initial condition, you can get very different results. Yeah, so I think it really should cause us to think very hard about the assumptions that we build into these models, and even the modeling basis going forward.
We have a question from Vicky Beer. Vicky is asking, can you talk about the need, potential value for experts who can synthesize results from lots of different fields?
I think that's
econ, behavioral science.
Yeah, that's a great question, Vicky. I think, I think that it's critical to have views from these different fields, and not just epidemiologists, because epidemiologists aren't trained necessarily in decision making, and or in behavioral, and particularly in behavioral decision making. So I think we need to have that expertise from these different areas, and I think it's another factor has been kind of this specialization, that we're all kind of specialists in one particular thing, whether it's optimization or whether it's stochastic model building, and we have to incorporate things like behavioral science and economics, as well as epidemiology, when we address issues like what we've seen with the pandemic.
I know we're a little bit over time right now. Again, I couldn't this, whatever you're saying, couldn't resonate more strongly with me, because the transplant work I've done and how it's evolved over a period of time, I could tell you there's huge amounts of lessons learned trying to see how people behave. And even getting information on their behaviors directly, as opposed to trying to assume something away.
Understanding how people behave and how people are actually making decisions, and people making decisions constantly. I think that's critical for how our models are used.
Yeah. Are there any other questions before we close the presentation? And of course, John's no stranger to any one of us, so I'm sure he's going to be more than happy to entertain other email questions. I don't see any hands going up, so maybe we should just close. John?
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay.
Really
Thanks,
appreciate it.
everyone. Thanks for
Very
coming.
enlightening. Very enlightening.
Thanks for
Thank you,
coming.
Tim.
Take care.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.